Hello, I'm Judy Schwartz, and I'm going to speak to you today about why Transnistria became the forgotten Holocaust and how it is slowly being remembered again. What was Transnistria? Let's talk for a minute about the history of the area. Transnistria means beyond the Dniester. It was an artificial geographic term that was created during the Second World War, and it refers to a region in the Ukraine that was part of the Soviet Union. It extends from the Dniester River on the west to the Bug River on the east, and it also extends southward to the Black Sea. At the beginning of the Second World War, there were about 3 million people who lived in Transnistria, of which 311,000 were Jews. Its largest city was Odessa, and Jews comprised about 30% of the population of that city. Soon after the German attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Jews who lived in Transnistria were annihilated by the Nazi Einsatzgruppen, that means a special duty unit, with the collaboration of the Romanian army. Within 2 months, by the end of August 1941, Germany had given Transnistria over to the Romanians as a reward for Romania's participation in the war against the Soviet Union. Immediately after that, Romania set in motion a plan to get rid of its own Jews from 3 areas: Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transnistria. In September 1941, the wartime Romanian leader, Marshal Ion Antonescu, ordered the Jews of Transnistria to be imprisoned in camps that were created along the Bug River. Soon after that, he ordered the Jews of Bessarabia and Bukovina to be deported to that same area. Originally, he was planning to drive them across the river into Nazi-occupied hands in the Soviet Union, but that never took place. Why? Simply because the Nazis in the Soviet Union said they couldn't accept them yet, and therefore they were stuck in Transnistria. So during October and November 1941, thousands of terrorized Jews of all ages were deported to this area of Transnistria. They were deported on foot or by wagon. They were deliberately pushed into the river on the way. Thousands have died that way. Those who survived and actually crossed the border were pushed into ghettos and into camps. And depending on whose numbers we accept, somewhere between 120,000 and 180,000 Jews were deported to Transnistria from Bessarabia and the northern part of Bukovina. Of this group, only 50,000 would survive the war. As I had said, Marshal Ion Antonescu had wanted to deport all of the Jews of the Romanian kingdom, not only those of Bukovina and Bessarabia. This area was known, Old Romania, as the Regat. Surprisingly, Nazi Germany wouldn't allow him to do it because they were afraid that by doing so, he would be crippling the Romanian economy, and he would diminish Romania's ability to meet its financial commitments to the Third Reich. So he had to, Antonescu, that is, had to postpone his plans. And the idea was that as soon as the Nazis would defeat the Soviet Union, he would deport all of the Jews of Romania to the Soviet Union for the Nazis to take care of them as part of the final solution. Meanwhile, Transnistria became the dumping grounds for close to 180,000 Jews, and they were put into 200 ghettos, or they were incarcerated in a number of camps that we see here on the map: Bogdanovka, Domanevka, and a few others, mostly or entirely run by the Romanians. As historian John Anshel says, between September 1941 and November 1942, at least 180,000 Ukrainian Jews were killed, mostly by Romanians, or handed over to local ethnic Jews for slaughter. Now, after Anshel finishes that, to this we add another 140,000 Romanian Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina, who were exterminated in Transnistria, along with another 100,000 Jews murdered by the Romanians in Bessarabia and in Bukovina during the summer of 1941. And this leads scholars to talk about somewhere between 410 to 420,000 Jews being killed as a result of Romania's wartime actions. This is up until the liberation of Transnistria, March 20th, 1944. So here's the question: why was Transnistria forgotten? Why is it that when we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about this ghetto, that ghetto, but so few people talk about Transnistria? Well, there were a number of reasons. The first is that early historical works only partially documented events from Transnistria. There's a documentation problem because the Jews from Transnistria who lived there were actually part of the Soviet Union, as opposed to the Romanian Jews who were resettled there. And consequently, we have to remember that documentation from the Soviet Union was barely available until the 1980s. There were, however, studies by Romanian scholars, such as Matatias Karp. He was the first who, in 1947, published the first significant record of the Holocaust in Romania and Transnistria, based largely on documents that he collected and preserved in the archives of the Union of Jewish Religious Communities in Bucharest, and the positions that were taken from those who survived the war. Soon after that, we have a few other books that documented the Holocaust in Transnistria. Julius Fischer's volume on Transnistria was published in 1969. More recent publications are those by John Angel and by Radu Ionid, who have all relied on the work of Matatias Karp, but they also benefited by using German and Romanian documentation that were eventually opened up in the Soviet archives that were opened during the past 20, 30 years, and documentation that was found in Israel. Another reason that Transnistria was forgotten was the attitude of Eastern European governments towards whatever happened in Transnistria during the 1940s and the 1990s. These included the Romanian authorities' denials of what happened, the Soviet system of lumping all the minorities together and calling all the victims Soviet citizens. This happened in various places where the Jews were even commemorated. For example, here we have a monument to the Holocaust victims in Tiraspol. Since 2016, the contemporary Transnistrian, Moldavan, and Donbass unrecognized republics have been commemorating the Holocaust and including information on it in their textbooks. In 2018, the monument that we see here in the picture was inaugurated in the Transnistrian capital of Tiraspol. However, we have to remember that these were instrumental for the purposes of these governments and not necessarily to commemorate the Jews. This was part of the separatist narrative of portraying the governments in Kiev, for example, as fascists and radical nationalists and people who did not learn from the mistakes of World War II, as they said. If we want to give this some type of a title, it's all part of what was called the memory wars in Eastern Europe. Who did what, and how can we use it to further our own gains today? Another reason is that these areas wanted to link into Jewish organizations and into their international networks. Once again, the Holocaust commemoration was just for their own internal and external legitimacy. But those aren't the only reasons that Transnistria wasn't remembered. Another reason is that the major Holocaust memorial organizations had different priorities between the 1950s and the 1990s. And throughout the world, even in Israel, the primacy and hegemony was given to stories about the Holocaust in Poland and in other places, only because of the pressure of young survivors who were no longer young by the time they were pressuring from Transnistria, did they begin to include the story of Transnistria in their educational departments. One of the people who was instrumental, Transnistrian survivors, instrumental in pushing a place like Yad Vashem to include the story of Transnistria was Avraham Ivanir. We'll hear about him in a few minutes. And he wrote as follows: during the 1950s and 1960s, Yad Vashem emphasized the Nazi extermination camps in Poland, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and other things, while countries that collaborated with the Nazis were not emphasized in Yad Vashem's activities and the museum, and this includes the Holocaust in Romania, Holocaust in Transnistria. Now, this began to change only at the beginning of the 21st century. However, even before they got into the educational department, there were publications that Yad Vashem had put out. The first one is Pinkasa Kehilot, Romania. That was published by Yad Vashem, the first volume in 1969, the second volume in 1980. There were additional volumes, but again, it didn't make its way into the educational system. The books existed, but they weren't studied throughout the world. Another reason that the Transnistrian Holocaust was forgotten had to do with the Bukovina, Bessarabia, and Transnistria survivor organizations. Why? Because many of them were not survivor organizations. They were organizations of Jews who had immigrated from these areas many of them before the Second World War. An example is you see a picture of their cemetery plot. This is the organization of Mihova and Baumel immigrants in the United States. Those are two areas in northern Bukovina that the Jews were all deported to Transnistria. Many of them died there. However, these organizations were formed long before the Second World War. In fact, the one that we see here was formed even before the First World War. It was established in New York in 1910 for the purpose of being a mutual aid society. And after a mutual aid society, it was to buy a cemetery plot, and all the names that you see in the picture here on the two sides of the post are names of Jews who all immigrated before World War I, and a few of them right after. They were members. Now, as soon as they heard what was happening to their families, what they tried to do during and right after the war, here we see a picture of the United Bukovina Relief Association that right after the war, they tried to ship all sorts of food and things to southern Bukovina and to areas in Romania where the Jews who had survived went after the war. But they were busy with mutual assistance. They weren't really busy with education. In Israel, the Organization of Jews from Bukovina was started in 1944. However, the survivor organizations only began much later to do things, and again, only for their own families and not for the general public. The larger organizations were founded even later, and if we're talking about the 1990s, so it's understood why until then the Holocaust in Transnistria was pretty much forgotten. The last group that we're going to talk about that were part of the question, or at least part of the answer, why the Holocaust in Transnistria and in Romania was forgotten, had to do with Jewish survivors from Romania, from Bukovina, Bessarabia, and those who had been in Transnistria. Most were young. Most who survived came out very young, and they were busy building their own lives for years and years afterwards. Here we have Romanian Jewish survivors arriving in Israel in 1951. They didn't have time to deal with education of the world to tell them about the Holocaust. So what was done to slowly begin remembering Transnistria? The first thing that happened was the government commemoration in Eastern Europe of Romania and Ukraine. 60 years after the war's end, Romania finally commemorated a commission that would deal with, we have a picture of the final report of the International Commission on the Holocaust in Romania. This was a commission that was headed of experts headed by Elie Wiesel to examine what happened in Romania during the war. This is all part of the post-communist attempts to describe and articulate a post-socialist democratic regime, in other words, to confront the country's past. This group gave in its conclusions in 2004, and the Romanian government accepted them. And this was part of something much larger going on in Europe at the time that was called the politics of regret. Official apologies and state regrets that were seen in the 1980s by many countries in Europe, including Britain, for example, apologizing for the British authorities' responsibility for the Irish potato famine of the mid-1880s. Totally not Holocaust related, but as I said, these politics of regret were something very general. Romania came to this rather late after most countries had already gone through the process. The committee stated that under the Antonescu regime, here we have a picture of Marshal Ion Antonescu as the leader of Romania during the war, between 280 and 380,000 Jews died in Transnistria and by the Romanian purges. And this was in addition to some 11,000 Romani people who lived. Not only Jews were killed in Transnistria. As a result, Romania designated October 9th as Holocaust Day. And on that day, because that was the day that the official deportation of Jews had begun from Bukovina to Transnistria, on that day, they recommended that Romania promote educational Holocaust programs and activities. A year later, in 2005, when the United Nations declared International Holocaust Memorial Day on January 27th, the Romanian educational system took advantage of that declaration. And now, instead of having to face what happened in Romania, it focused primarily on the Holocaust in general. When they were forced to focus on local activities, then they did so basically about what happened in the Hungarian areas of Transnistria and nothing having to do with Romania. Now, Romania also has its academic institutions of memory, the Eloizel National Institute for Studying the Holocaust in Romania, which was established in 2005, the Wilhelm Filderman Center for the Study of Jewish History of Romania, established in 1977, Institutes for Jewish History, Hebrew Studies, Israel Studies at the universities of Babeș-Bolyai and Cluj, at the University of Bucharest, the University of Iași, the University of Arad. Question is it successful? So there are institutes, but what do they do? Well, in a study that was done in 2017, it says that 68% of the Romanians had never heard of the Holocaust, and Antonescu was still perceived as a tremendous patriot. So other studies have already shown that the absence of Jews in the Romanian borderlands is the new normalcy. People don't remember them, and after 80 years, it's been wiped out. There is a positive side, and that is that a Holocaust memorial was created, erected in Bucharest, and that was unveiled on October 8th, 2009. There are promises that are made for a Jewish and Holocaust museum in Bucharest. There are attempts to begin teaching the Holocaust in the educational system in Romania, but there's still a long way to go. Another problem has to do with large public Holocaust memorial organizations. As we said in the beginning, they weren't really pushing the idea of teaching the Holocaust in Romania. How did that change? Thanks, among others, to the prodding of the Yad Vashem board of director member, Avram Ivanir, who, until he had been in Transnistria as a child, he was in constant correspondence having to do with educational activities in Yad Vashem. And finally, from 2007 onward, he wrote them incessantly and met with people there that Yad Vashem should include educational material about Romania, Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transnistria, and he actually succeeded. In addition, they were also, here's a picture of Avram Ivanir, and you see him on the background of Yad Vashem. And I should add, he's also my cousin. I'm very proud of the things that he did to remember the history. He was a small child in Transnistria, and he made it his life's work after retiring to push organizations, and particularly Yad Vashem, where he's a member of the board, to include it in their educational activities. And it's also, Romania is also included in the Valley of the Destroyed Jewish Communities at Yad Vashem and special exhibitions. And he pushed survivor organizations, including those that he belonged to commemorate the Holocaust of Transnistria and the Jews of Romania, not only in organizational activities, but equally important on their websites. Today, we live in a digital world. This is a picture of the new website of AMIR, AMIR, which is the acronym of the United Organization of Romanians in Israel. And here's the new website of the World Organization of Jews from Bukovina. All of them are open to the public, and they serve as a basis for educational activity. And here's Bukovina sites as well. The last thing that actually has been helping promote the idea of learning about the Holocaust in Romania and the Holocaust in Transnistria has to do with survivors and members of the second, third, and even fourth generation. And one example is something that I was part of at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, where I serve as a guest historian and curator. I was involved in putting together their core exhibition. They have a new core exhibition that was opened last year. And one of the things that I made sure would be that the history of the Jews of Transnistria, of the Jews of Romania, those who were deported to Transnistria, and the story of what happened, the Holocaust in Transnistria, would be included. So just to show you, this was the core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do. And here are some of the things that we decided to include. The entrance, if you take a look, this is the entrance corridor. And as you walk along the corridor, you have pictures of Jews from before the Holocaust. And here's one of the pictures, Dvora Enzenberg, a small town called Miova in the 1930s. She was my great-grandmother. And you can see that she's standing on a rug at the entrance to her home in Miova. She was among those Jews who was deported to Transnistria, and she lost her life there. When you go on in the exhibition, we have this panel that talks about the history of Transnistria. And it says, after invading the Soviet Union, Germany granted part of Ukraine to its ally Romania. which named the region Transnistria beyond the Dniester River. In September 1941, Romania began deporting Jews from Bukovina and Bessarabia to ghettos and camps in Transnistria. Many died of disease or starvation en route or after arrival. There, they were joined by survivors of a massacre in Odessa who were interned in 3 camps, Bogdanovka, Akhmechevka, and Domanevska. Most were killed by Romanian troops and the Ukrainian auxiliaries. The Romanians established more camps in the winter of 1941-1942. Few prisoners survived. In addition to the 185,000 local Ukrainian Jews murdered, by 1944, over 90,000 of the 150,000 Jews deported to Transnistria had been murdered or died of harsh conditions, like my great-grandparents, both of whom died of starvation in Transnistria. And if you remember the rug that my great-grandmother was standing on, here is the rug that my great-aunt, my grandmother's youngest sister, who had been with her parents in Transnistria, managed to save, and it was donated to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And here is the rug with the story of how my great-grandfather, when he was deported, was not permitted back into the house to take a coat, even though it was cold. And he picked up the rug from the floor, wrapped it around his shoulders, and this was his coat until he died in Transnistria. And here again, we have a small panel in the museum that just shows a personal story in order to make Transnistria personal, to make the Holocaust in Romania personal to anybody who comes to the exhibition. One rug, one family, one couple, representing everything that happened there. So this gives you a pretty much of a picture of what the second, third, and even fourth generations are doing in order to keep the story of the Holocaust in Romania and in Transnistria alive. Here we have pictures of the Holocaust of Roma in Transnistria, and here are objects that one family took with them, the Radulescu family. We tell the whole story of Transnistria, not only what happened to the Jews, but pretty much what happened to all the victims there. So that's about it. I thank you very much for listening, and more than that, I thank you for remembering together with me.